Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. Good morning, Chris. I'm recording.
Good morning. Or afternoon for me. Or is it evening? It might be evening now. It's getting dark already.
It's so, it's so weird. That which we take for granted in terms of communications technology nowadays. I mean, again, I still marvel at the fact that you're on the other side of the planet, or you could say we're on opposite sides of the planet. There is considerable rock. There's crust, mantle, all kinds of stuff between the shortest distance between the two of us. Yeah. And yet here we are talking, and it's nighttime there, or evening, or whatever, and it's morning for me. That's amazing.
Weird. Yeah, it is quite strange. Yeah, I think 10 years ago, this would have been very difficult.
Yeah.
Bizarrely, if it hadn't been costly. The one good thing about COVID, until COVID, Zoom wasn't really a thing. And because of COVID, Zoom became a thing.
True.
Obviously, other talking things are and have always been available, but Zoom seems to do a good job of this.
Yeah, it does. It does. Hold on. Let me change my background to be congruent to our topic for today.
So have you done any gaming since Monday? I assume that's no. Shock. Oh, my God. Okay, I forgot about that fourth strand of the property.
There's a fifth also, but we'll get to that. No, I have done no
boxes.
How about you? In the last 3 days, probably.
Last 3 days, I think I'm hoping I've read more Icon. Otherwise, I'm gonna struggle to run it. I mean, we're not running it this week because Scott's away, so I've got at least another week. Yeah, I don't think I've even read anything. I attempted to buy some miniatures. I think that's about the closest I get to gaming, and they didn't have the miniatures I was hoping to get. So I was
going to say, how do you attempt to buy something? I guess
I went to the shop because it said they had them. When I got there, they didn't. So I will have to buy them online. So,
Well, cool. Well,
today
we're going to pick up with actually, we've done a number of episodes like this, but we haven't done one in a while.
Yeah, we did Ghostbusters a very, very long time ago. And then we did James Bond.
We've done Star Wars.
We did do Star Wars. Yeah.
I think we've done a few others.
I think those are the ones we've done like this, where we have an episode on what are the important elements that make up this property, and then a second episode on 2D20. Yeah. So today we are going to look at, you can sing it, so.
G.I. Joe.
Yeah, which is bizarre. Because I know in the UK, and actually it might be the rest of Europe, I don't know, we didn't have G.I. Joe initially. We had a property called Action Man, which is like the big figure, the big model. It's called Action Man in this country. And then when they tried to bring G.I. Joe over here, they tried to relate to that. So we got something called Action Force. So initially, when I was reading comics in, I don't know, let's say it's probably almost certainly was the 80s, mid to late 80s anyway. You'd buy an Action Force comic, and the first half would be like with Action Force. So all the characters had the same code names, but what they would do is they would change their backgrounds. So characters, so for example, like Flint and Lady J, who were on the picture behind me.
Yes.
They G.I. Joe originally was all American. But in Action Force, I think they were both English. And then you had like Airtight was a German chemical weapons person, and Barbecue was an Italian fireman. It was like, so they all had these different nationalities because it was a worldwide organization. But the weird thing, you have the first half of the comic would be this Action Force with you'd have these like readouts of things with the different nationalities. But the second half was the original Larry Hama G.I. Joe comic.
Okay.
And so you'd have these inconsistency between the two parts of the comic. And it wasn't until I was much older and you got the internet and you realize, oh, okay, that's what was going on. It's literally two completely different comics.
It's like smushed together.
Yeah, smushed together. But eventually in the UK, they did kind of realize that, well, Action Force wasn't really a big, so they went with G.I. Joe. So when the G.I. Joe film came out here, it was still G.I. Joe. And if they did a G.I. Joe cartoon now, and I assume if there are toys now, they are G.I. Joe now. But
it's interesting. It's that you make me think of that when a creative property is translated or transferred or used in another country outside, like far outside of it's call it birth context, it is funky how things happen sometimes. Like I remember learning years later that the three Robotech series, Macross, um, Robotech Masters, that is the Southern Cross. What are you doing?
I haven't done anything. What the
The hell
hell
was that?
just
Like a bunch of balloons just appeared over my head. I shook my hand around and
How
stupid.
did you?
Anyway, I have
Is
no
that just
idea.
a Zoom
That
thing?
was really bizarre.
You
Those who are
disappeared.
listening, all of a sudden over my Zoom video, like balloons appeared and floated up over my head. So anyway,
Ah,
yeah. So there were Macross, Southern Cross, that is Masters, and then Invid Invasion, or I think Mospita, whatever. I could be getting these things wrong, but I remember learning that those three cartoon series in Japan were completely unrelated.
yeah.
They had no connection, and when they were bought and used over here, they reskinned, through voiceover, they made them one story. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Now I put behind me, I put the GI Joe with which I was first uh, connected. And I had the Big Trapper, I had the Adventure Team GI Joe, I had the Eagle Eyes GI Joe back in the late '70s, and I
Is that the
had an
one you look
Intruder.
through? You look
What's
through
that?
his eyes, or is that the one you look through the back of
No,
his head?
on the back of his head there was a little tab, and you could slide it back and forth, and his eyes would track left to right. Eagle Eyes GI Joe, and his hair, he had like real hair. It was really fuzzy and smelled weird. And then it started to fall out, so it was like I had like alopecia GI Joe. It's kind of a thing. But yeah, I had GI Joe with the Big Trapper and the Intruder and some other stuff. And my older brothers, they had the original GI Joes, like back in the late '60s, early '70s, where it was like full on, you know, Cold War era military GI Joe. But yeah, the essential elements of GI Joe, probably a very broad take with, I think, a concentration on your side of the GI Joe, less mine.
I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? Because GI, the consistency between GI Joe is the names of the characters and what, in fact, even the looks. Because I think the only Snake Eyes pretty much always looks the same.
Yeah.
But with the exception of that, even between different properties. So we were saying that different properties. So I first came across the GI Joe, obviously with a different name, but I first came to GI Joe as a comic, and then
Yeah.
actually toys like you, more modern toys than that. But
Oh yeah.
mine had kung fu grips and but
I
actually
might
probably
have had
didn't get
Kung Fu
kung fu
grip until the
grips.
fingers
Yours had
fell
kung fu
off.
grips. Actually, mine just had guns and stuff.
Mine too.
So yeah, I came across it as a comic, and then I saw the cartoon,
Mm-hmm.
and the cartoon is quite similar to the comic,
Yeah.
other than the fact that because they couldn't have a cartoon for kids with people firing like M16s and Uzis at people, all of the guns were laser guns, if I remember correctly.
Right.
So you have these big shots of like GI Joes and Cobra all firing
Yep.
lasers at each other, which apparently didn't really do a lot because no one got, so people aren't getting like bullets shredded. Whereas like in the comic, I remember like reading the comics, like the backstory of Snake Eyes, where literally, I think it's the helicopter engine explodes and just in his face and just
Yeah.
literally takes his face off. Yeah, funnily enough, they didn't show that
No.
detail in the cartoon. It was in the
No.
comics.
It's interesting. I mean, GI Joe. Here's my quick, like, hopefully no more than 2 minutes history of the property as a whole, bringing us up to the GI Joe that we'll really focus on, which is the GI Joe about which you're talking. Is that GI Joe as a toy started in the 1960s with an idea to build not dolls, because boys don't play with dolls. That was the
Yeah.
conceit, that was the assertion, but action figures. In fact, the term action figure was coined by the makers of GI Joe as a marketing piece of marketing rhetoric. And so, it was GI Joe, and there's a whole connection to America's experience in World War II and the Korean War and ages of the folks working at the toy factory and the people who, the designers and the fathers to whom they were marketing to the, through to the sons, that kind of thing. And then in the '70s, after America's experience in Vietnam, there was a movement against like the full-on military face or look of GI Joe, and so they changed him more into this like world adventurer type who does like research and adventures and finds things and saves animals. Like it was this kind of loose, there was you could see like seeds of Captain Planet in it here and there. That was the GI Joe that I played with when I was a kid. There was no cartoon. I do have 4 read along 45 RPM story records, which I still have, which have the little bing, turn the page. Tells you to turn the page. And if you're too young to know what the heck that is, go look it up online. You are
Oh
missing
man,
out. You are
they were so
missing out.
good.
Your
Yeah.
childhood is lesser because of it. Um, and then that fell by the wayside. Like as a property, that became less popular. And it was in the early 80s. It was like 82, 81, 82, 83, somewhere in that time frame. 82, 83, I think, when the owners of GI Joe decided to recast it again. And what they did is they came up with this idea of, instead of the character is GI Joe, and there were a few different Joes when I was a kid, but they were all essentially like you just referred to it. Oh, that's GI Joe, no matter what character you had. What they decided to do is recast the story and create more of a coherent story behind it. And that's where this idea of the team is called GI Joe. And then out of that comes this whole idea of this like weirdo bunch of experts with all kinds of different abilities and code names and stuff like that. And that came out first as a comic book that complemented the toy line. Um, and then it grew quickly thereafter into a cartoon that directly supported the toy line. And incidentally, here's a bit of trivia for you. Do you know why, out of the original run of figures, Snake Eyes, they made Snake Eyes and they said, all right, we're just going to make him all black? It saved money on ink. And I'm not talking about the comic books. I'm talking about for the figures.
Yeah, that
It
makes
was
sense.
it was a manufacturing issue, a decision that they made. But yeah, I think the main GI Joe that we should focus on. Sadly, we're not going to talk about the Big Trapper and the intruder coming from outer space to threaten him. Um, we'll talk about the Joe team. Uh, and what are the essential elements of it that we could suss out of it so that we could say, hey, what would you do with a game for this? Now, I know, and you know, that there is already a licensed GI Joe role-playing game, but forget about
But
that.
that didn't stop us doing Star Wars
Nope.
or James Bond.
We think
Although there
2D20
isn't
does
currently
most
a licensed
everything
one.
better. So,
Or Ghostbusters.
or Ghostbusters, that's true. So
All of those.
what is we'll call this the like GI Joe Prime, the main GI Joe property that most people know of, that the movies are like mutant adaptations of. We're talking about the original toy line from the 80s. We're talking about the cartoons that accompanied it, and to an extent also the comic books. What's the
Uh,
first essential element of that for a
I
game?
mean,
No, for,
you've got to have this sort of military special ops style thing. That's what they are a special ops team where every character has some kind of speciality. Not necessarily potentially a speciality in their weapon, but half of them, some of them have special weapons, but some of them just use the same. But they have a speciality in
yeah.
why they are in the team. Every
Yes.
single person has, I'm the such and such guy, or girl. And so that's the super you need. So you do need some element of like niche protection in how
Yes.
you make the characters. There has to be something that your character's unique selling point, which is
Yes.
literally the point of the models as well. So I mean that's a big deal for me. If your if two people can have really similar characters, that's not GI Joe.
I think that there's a hand waved, let's not look too closely assumption that just about they're all experts. They're all really good at a lot of different things. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, like I knew guys who were Green Berets who were good at a hell of a lot of different things as soldiers who were really good at their niche. So that I can accept that. But I think you're right that yeah, niche control and I don't want to jump too far because that's our mechanical episode about this, but I don't think that would be class based. There can't
no,
be
because
classes.
you would run out of classes
Yeah, you totally would.
very quickly.
The silly thing is that it would become, I almost said cartoonish, which doesn't make sense in this context, but it
No, I
would
mean
become
if someone wants to do classes, you can have, you can have like a scout or a rogue class, you can have a heavy and so on. But if that's the only way you can really distinguish your characters, they will end up being too similar.
Yeah.
So you
Well,
need,
unless you had, maybe you had categories, and then then within those categories you would create a
yeah,
unique sub niche within it. But yeah, I think you're right. There has to be niche control, and on top of that, I also think that this is building off of that. Everybody is unique
yes.
in a way. You're not
I
going to
think
have two.
everyone should be unique on the good guys anyway. I mean, you
Yes.
always have the weird thing that you can read a bunch of or watch a bunch of GI Joe cartoons and you only ever see the main characters. But then behind the main characters, they did kind of have this like a bunch of just like they were technically GI Joes, but they weren't named GI Joes.
Yeah.
If it was Star Trek, they'd be red shirts, but
Yeah.
so they just had like all green uniforms and they had a gun, but they only turned up when there was like a massive battle. Just like because Cobra had lots and lots of, Cobra has way less named characters. Cobra
Yeah.
has a lot more of like rank and file. So you have your basic troopers, but then you have all these other things.
That's
So
an interesting inversion. I hadn't thought of it
yeah,
that way. That on the bad guy side, the only people who matter, there's a small number of people who matter, and a whole bunch of nameless mooks.
yeah.
Sounds like communism. And it's just the people who get statues and get to stand up at the top of Red Square that matters. Everyone else, no one else has a face.
Well, that's ironic because Cobra Commander didn't have a face.
Well, he did, but he just hid it behind a mirrored shield.
Yeah.
But then it's inverted on the Joe side. So yeah,
I think riffing off that, I think another really important thing is that I would want to come up against maybe not, straight away fighting them, but I would want to be seeing these bad guys. Now, this is a dig at the current game because this is something I've heard, but the current game does use a level system. But the current game uses a level system where all of the NPCs, so all of the characters we know and love, if you like it, or whatever, have levels. So I from what I'm hearing, people like Destro's level 15 and Cobra Commander's like level 18, and so, which means that a starting character can never ever you can't even come anywhere near those.
right.
So you have to just fight like your basic, and anyone with a name at all. So even if someone like one of the twins who is a bit lower down, you're still like level 10 or 11.
Yeah.
So this isn't a case of where they're going to be powerful and it's difficult and you shouldn't. This is just they will, just one-on-one they would destroy you.
Right.
That's not realistic. Like at the end of the day, these people are all humans. Okay, they're really, really skilled in their area. But in a one-on-one fight, pretty much any Joe could take any Cobra character and vice versa,
Yeah.
depending on things like if they've got the advantage, or a 2-on-1 would probably be the end of that. I can't, maybe with the exception of like, Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes, because they're ninjas. And we know that, this is how I grew up with no ninjas are so over the top.
Of course.
Because I read G.I. Joe. Any G.I. Joe ninjas had beat everything. But with the exception of those ninjas, if it was a 2-on-1, any character would take on with any other ones. Well, the system doesn't work. So you need to have a thing. I want to be able to have a starting G.I. Joe character with a group. They come up against a bad guy. I want to know that that's a realistic fight, because I want it to be, because although the comics, it was comic booky, it wasn't superhero comic booky.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? There was some degree of reality in G.I. Joe.
Actually, I think that there was more of a degree of reality, quote unquote, in that there was a greater, I think there was more. I didn't read a whole lot of the comics. I mean, like I've said this before, I was never really a huge comic book reader, but I did read, I don't know, maybe like the first 10 or so, 50, whatever, like whatever, maybe more, and then a smattering of others of the comics. And I do feel like they went farther to explain the technical and organizational like development aspects of things. Back to the essential elements, because what I don't want to do at least is go too much onto the mechanical side, because we got to let this sink in so we can come up with better ideas than a level based system that's out there now. So you've got that. I think that in addition to your unique niches, which is essential, you've also got to have lots of gonzo technology.
Yes.
It can't, I think there's a point where it could become ridiculous, which sometimes it did in the cartoons, but you need to have lots of of really high tech stuff that your folks, your characters are using. And I think a lot of times that's tied to the niche.
Yeah, I think it's gone so, but I would have stuck with like it's kind of like it's James Bond
Mm-hmm.
maybe plus rather than say Mission Impossible. So because most of the vehicles they use are based on real world vehicles. Now,
Yeah.
occasionally, then they throw in something which is a little bit more left field. They're not creating time machines, but they probably have got massive EMPs. And nowadays, I can imagine they'd probably have AI and all kinds of stuff like that. But yeah, the definitely stuff that you think it would be on the verge of like cutting edge, maybe what's possible, maybe putting a bit more, which is what we see in the James Bond stuff. I can imagine it's
Yeah.
technology like like that
Well,
level of technology. It's
I know
not
there were episodes when they went into space. Um, and
oh,
I,
we can do that now.
yeah, you can do that. And then all like, the jet packs and all that
Yeah.
kind of
Oh yeah,
stuff.
yeah. Good. That's a good example.
And you know what
Yeah, I
too
think
is
jetpacks is a very good example because jetpacks in the real world are not great.
are underwhelming.
Yeah.
Um, Beyond though, just amazing high tech that still feels like, I mean, it's pulpy. I think that should be it.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I'll come back to
There
that.
also just has to be a lot of technology, equipment, and vehicles that are available, and I think that's connected to the military side. Like this
Yes.
idea of you're priming a weapon, you're slamming a magazine into it, and you've got like I remember the first episode that I saw of the cartoon back in the 80s of when Shipwreck showed up, and Shipwreck is like driving this.
You have a parrot.
He has a parrot, um, and he's driving this ridiculous, like bastardized. Is it a duck? Is it a friggin' Higgins boat? He's like driving a like an amphibious landing craft. He's driving this thing that isn't any one real vehicle, but is kind of a mutant amalgam of a couple of different amphibious landing. He's just driving this around. It's like he's like hanging out. I think he like gets in a bar fight with some of the Joes, and he's got this thing like parked outside, and he's nowhere near the water. It's like, oh yeah, let's just give this sailor this vehicle and just let him drive it around. Like that's not high tech at all, even in that setting. But it's the it's your niche related thing,
Yeah.
niche related item, which could be high tech or not. I think those things need to be available too because they they provide the immediate material context that identifies a character. I think that's important.
I definitely say in terms of technology, I think the bad guys should have the better like the good guy stuff should be like either crazily experimental or stuff that we have but maybe a bit better. The bad guys should be doing space lasers and like robots and like cloning or something because they are beyond what we see. They have the cartoonish personality of a James Bond bad guy, but they really do have properly stupid technology, which makes them, that makes them more interesting. They in theory should win. The reason they're not is because they have to hide in the shadows, and God knows where they get their money from.
Well, I think
And
also,
they
I
have to
think you're
lose as
right.
well.
I think you're right that the bad guys have to have the technology that you could explain away by saying, well, like they take all these risks with their tests, or they've stolen the technology, or they found some ancient something or other that enabled them to achieve it. Um, but I think, and here's an essential element, is that the bad guys have to be made up of two types: the infighting leaders and the only mildly competent masses.
Yeah.
Like, if all of your average Cobra blue shirts were as good as your average Joe, they would win. One would
Yeah.
think that, but they're not. They can't be because they keep losing. And if it weren't, it seems to me like I remember years ago thinking of an idea to run at a convention. I couldn't nail down the system, and then it was just one of those like overly complicated ideas that I dropped. The idea of running a GI Joe campaign. This was long before the game was announced, and run it in two halves. The first half would be the players are playing Destro and the Baroness and they're playing all the bad guys, and they're plotting and planning, and they come up with this plot and plan, which part of which is undercut because there's all this infighting and backstabbing, and then we would take a break, and then the second half would be now you play the Joes trying to thwart the evil plan. But I think that you've had this strange like friction on the Cobra side of things, which is the masses. There are a lot of them, and they have great technology, but they're really not that great individually. And the leaders are always stabbing each other in the back to some extent.
I forgot about that, but you're actually right. Yeah, like the bad guys are actually individually incredibly competent, intelligent,
Yep.
well-skilled people, probably better than some of the GI Joes, but they're all out for themselves.
So egotistical,
they're always
backstabbing, and
each other over.
megalomaniacal. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a really good point. You mentioned it earlier. I wanted to come back to it. I think GI Joe should be, if you're doing a GI Joe game, I think it should be quite pulpy. So
Yes.
although, like, bits of it should feel realistic in terms of, like, sort of your day-to-day technology and like, what guns people have and stuff like that. I don't want the laser guns out of the cartoon. I want people to have proper, assault rifles and so on. But there should be, like characters probably don't, the masses will. Your basic Cobra they could just die left, right, and center, just rack up the body count. That'd be fine.
Yeah.
But like, Destro isn't dying anytime soon.
No.
He's, you think he's dead, but you don't get the body. That kind of pulpy thing of that the people maybe don't. Or they're not dead. They're in a coma, or they've been cloned, or basically the exact thing that we see in comic book. So it has a realistic bent to it because people aren't leaping tall buildings in a single bound and shooting lasers through walls. But at the same time, this is based on a comic book property, and we need, the main characters should live to fight another, and the bad guys, because otherwise
beyond that too, there isn't mass death. There's threat. There's the perceived threat of violence. But what happened when a Cobra, what is it? What were those little things called? The little trouble bubbles, the little jetpack.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Bubble over top. Or when a Cobra hiss tank got hit, what happened?
I mean, they just stopped, really, didn't they? Well, there'd be an explosion.
Anything airborne,
crash.
It would crash, but then a dude with a parachute would fall out. Nobody ever died in the cartoon. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's some episode where they decided to get all dreary and stuff, but nobody ever died. And the joke, no one ever died in the cartoon.
It'd be one of those things. Like, I think in the film they may have killed one person. Of course, it would have been a really big deal and super emotional and stuff. But yeah, I mean that's why they switched them all to do with have lasers, so that people aren't dying. I mean, if you were playing this, it's one of those choices you can make. Whether the mooks die or are just KO'd, it really doesn't matter.
You can just write it off by saying they're defeated.
Exactly.
Just leave it to the
It's GM. Irrelevant. They are gone. It's like, you do it a lot in most role-playing games, and the people, well, are they dead or on KO? Most players will be like, oh, yeah, they're dead.
They're dead.
Because for some reason, most players are just sociopaths. They have no care about racking up a body count. That's a whole episode we should do on about how okay is it to just randomly kill huge waves.
How do you solve that problem? Killing.
Yeah.
You have a problem with the look, just kill him. What? There's rending the social fabric into bit. Anyway, barely anyone ever dies. And in the cartoon, like, nobody died. Now, something else about the cartoon, and this makes sense because it is it's a TV property. I think but it's essential in the storytelling is that I think this has to be cinematic storytelling.
Yeah.
In other words, it can't be like a Robert Jordan book that the whole thing is written in real time and every single tiny little step needs to take place and be explained and described. Like this has to, we've talked about what makes a role-playing game cinematic. It's not just action, it's being seen, and to a lesser extent, this is more for the GM, act-based. Like for the characters and the players and the GM, scenes are very much a thing. And I think that because this is from a TV show originally, the storytelling is scene-based. So I think you have to accept that and leverage it, because that actually enables you to, as you are working through a story in this, that there are things that you can hand wave that you don't need to explain all the connective tissue. A scene ends, you say, hey, we're gonna get the flying submarine, because we're going to get the flying submarine, and we're going to, we're going to attack the Cobra R&R facility in Antarctica. And so you're at the GI Joe headquarters, getting the experimental flying submarine ready, and the next scene you're in the airspace over Antarctica, and you just don't have to explain the in between. That's when a toy commercial happens.
Yeah.
So I think that's a piece of it that isn't necessarily of the story, but is part of the delivery of the story, that you have to treat this cinematically.
You know what is really important from the comic, from the cartoon rather? There should be a public service announcement.
I love it.
Where you can finish with the thing with the knowing is half the battle.
Actually, that, you know what? Now, I know we said we're not going to talk about the mechanics much, but that'd be hilarious as a mechanic. Of course, it might be a little too on the nose and silly, but like maybe you get like an end of session experience boost or something if you provide a relevant PSA.
Yeah, no, I think every player during the session should have, if they can drop a useful public service announcement message, don't do drugs and so on. Then they get they get whatever meta currency you're using, they should get something. There you go, have a fortune point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would actually be hilarious. Yeah, the reality, there isn't a huge GI Joe for me. It's always the characters. There's a reason why like they keep doing Snake Eyes, and there's a reason why they think, right, we're going to do a spin-off or restart GI Joe, is that they did a Snake Eyes thing, which is like, if you didn't like the other one, don't watch the GI Joe film because it's not very good. It's because some of the characters are just really, they have, some of them have cool designs, some of them have cool things, their speciality, some of them have just cool characters. So some of the characters are just really cool characters that have stood the test of time. And that's actually what makes it stand out. And that's on the good and the bad side. That's what makes G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe would have died a long time ago. But the characters are cool. So people keep coming back to it.
I think also the characters, I think you're right. And I think that obviously that's an essential element, but I think that's an essential focus.
Yeah.
It's on the characters, but then the characters are able to shine and be the cool characters that they are because of these melodramatic and overwrought plots. So I think that's another piece that needs to be in there.
I do think that actually makes it difficult to play a game. So I think unlike when we talked about sort of, James Bond, yes, James Bond's the main character, but it's all the other stuff that goes on that makes James Bond interesting. And when we talked about Ghostbusters, it's the technology and the ghosts, which make, okay, they were cool characters, but you can still get a lot of the feel of Ghostbusters just from the other stuff. Yeah. And like Star Wars, we say, yes, for a lot of people, Star Wars is the characters, but for me, it's the whole world around it. G.I. Joe is a bit weird in that it is almost the characters. So if you make characters and your characters are just not very you're gonna have to make characters that are, they're not one note, they're not two-dimensional. They have a niche, and actually the look of them is very important, but then they should have a personality that backs it up and some cool backstory. And like one, I can't remember which one it is, but like one of the characters, and he just wears like a little vest thing, and he has a little hat and some big tattoos, but he's a chef as well. That's kind of little Roadblock thing there which makes that character.
Look at that Roadblock. He's right there next to Snake Eyes behind you.
All right, there's another one like Roadblock who's someone different then, who I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
I can't remember his name.
Yeah, Roadblock is a big guy. He's a machine gunner, and he's also a chef.
Yeah, he's the one that they did as probably got the chef bit wrong. I was gung ho I'm thinking of, but I can't remember what his background thing was. But so a lot of these characters had like just personality quirks that make them interesting. It's the kind of thing that's actually role playing character do, but a lot of time people play their characters down because they don't want their character to be sort of a bit cartoony or silly. Well, actually, this literally based on a cartoon and a comic book. It should be cartoony.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not interesting.
Yeah. I also think that this is more on the game mechanics inside, but I don't know. My sense is that this is probably something that would be better for short focused runs of several sessions. Like you play an arc, but everyone's preferences are different. Maybe someone really digs G.I. Joe a bunch and wants to maintain a Joe-like level of action where there's enough depth, but not too much depth. Like the cartoon never got that serious. You know what I mean? Like nobody got crippled. or anything like that. It didn't, none of the Joes ever suffered from PTSD or, I don't say that lightly, like there are all kinds of things about explosions in action and, crazy, what is it that one of my favorite episodes was the one where like Destro and Scarlet realize they're related because there's some weird Cthulhu mansion that is connected to their family. No, I'm not kidding. And like at the very end, there's some like bubbling tentacled thing in a well in the bottom of a house. Yeah, it's like, where the hell did Lovecraft make an appearance here? But there's very few places. There's like a threshold that the G.I. Joe cartoon never goes beyond in terms of seriousness, of impact, of, you're not going to explore that side of that kind of life in G.I. Joe. And I wonder over time, like, would it get old if you wanted to run a really long campaign? But whatever, that's another discussion.
All right. I can't think of anything else.
No. So, okay. So what's our list?
At us that we've forgotten something really, really obvious.
What then is the list?
So quite clearly defined and different characters. Is that kind of what we're going for?
Yeah, a niche and no one's in the same niche.
Yeah.
There aren't going to be two fighters in a party.
Pulpy in that pulpy sense of no one really dies.
Yeah.
Cool technology.
And lots of technology and equipment, even if it's not cool high tech.
Yeah.
Lots of technology and equipment.
Crazy Bond villain bad guy plots.
Subcompetent bad guy flunkies in great quantities.
I think that's the main stuff, isn't it? Yeah, that feels like.
And then cinematic pacing.
Oh, and public service announcements. Absolutely. All right. Yeah, I think that's.
All right, good deal. So in the next episode, we'll think about, while I'm on vacation, I might even put some thought into what could you do. And I mean, obviously our default's, I think 2D20 as a system. And I think I can already think of some things where it would work well with that. And we'll think of some ideas and then we'll talk system.
Yep.
And between now and then, kids, don't huff paint.
Yeah.
There you go.
Knowing is half the battle.
Knowing is half the battle. Knowing not to huff paint is half the battle. The other half of the battle is not huffing the paint. There you go. Or shellac or anything like that.
Why is it only half the battle? It's like, is it the action?
I don't know. There's something about it that sounds profound, but it also quietly asks you to not inquire further. Like, wait. Years ago, I'll end with this. I mean, golly, this was 30 years ago. I remember, I remember seeing a bumper sticker on the back of someone's car that said, "Delta Airlines, we know how to fly." Like, if that isn't the height of trite, if that isn't just the height of ridiculous, you're like, no kidding. Really,
I mean, that is the bare minimum that you expect of an airline.
Like, we're minimally proficient. That's what they're saying. But I think knowing is half the battle. It like sounds like, oh wow, that's really something. But yeah, don't inquire further, please.
I've never thought about that before.
There's another half. There's no other half.
It's like what? The other half's the doing. Half the time it was not to do something. So knowing it is half the battle, and the other half of the battle is not doing the thing you know not to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, great.
Oh, well.
Perfect. All right. We will be back then./Thanks so much. Thank you so much for listening. You can visit our show's homepage at anchor.fm/fluffncrunch. That's FLUFFNCRUNCH. We would really appreciate feedback and reviews on whatever podcasting platform you're listening to this on. Thanks so much.